Hey, I'm Matt with Stronger You. I show you how to build your total so that you can compete in a powerlifting meet and do it all with less than 5 hours a week in the gym. Now, a lot of the common powerlifting programs that we see these days, things like StrongLifts 5x5, 531 is a really popular one, or even the more custom apps, things like Juggernaut AI or Evolve, all have a very heavy reliance on specificity, the idea of doing the lift that you're trying to get better at and very close relations to those. And they do those quite often. You might see in a lot of these programs something like a heavy bench day every week and a heavy squat day every week and that sort of idea. And that can absolutely work, but what do you do if you're that lifter who has a really physical job outside of the gym where the higher frequencies are something that are just really hard for you to recover from, or maybe you even do really well in building and then by the time it's time to get to that next PR, you're just running into recovery issues, or maybe you have a week of overtime at work and then it feels like your whole training block has been thrown out. So today I'm gonna actually go through a case study of a lifter that I work with who works as a helicopter mechanic. And with him, JR, we're going to talk exactly about the problems he was having with his lifting, where he was stuck around that sort of 200-pound mark on his bench. And in spite of not being extremely advanced at that point in his strength, he was running into issues with the more conventional programming styles, where he would just end up beat up and having to throw away an entire training block to where he wasn't really seeing meaningful progress. And his shoulders and forearms and elbows were always just really bothering him whenever he got anywhere near a PR. And we'll talk about a case study on how we first off fixed a lot of those aches and pains we did, and then more importantly, how we took him from where he was there to his most recent PR of a 255-pound bench triple for 3 reps, and how we're actually taking this strategy to use it to build towards getting him to his regional qualifying total goals early next year at his next meet. But before we jump in, if you're not already, I'd recommend that you subscribe so you can get updates and notifications whenever I put out new case study videos and resources like this, so that you can PR your total as fast and effectively and efficiently as possible. And down in the description below, you'll find a couple other useful links. First off will be the actual program that we're talking about today, what's taken JR to his most recent set of PRs, as well as a link to my powerlifting community of over 4,000 members called Starting Powerlifting. In there, I share other resources. In fact, right now, there's 12 other in-depth resources that'll show you everything from how to improve your depth on your squat, fix your mobility, up to long drawn out 20-week power building programs to help you gain muscle and increase your strength in the gym. It's also a really easy way to ask questions and get some free advice so you can level up with your lifting. So without further ado, let's jump in and let's talk about how we got JR past those initial issues he was facing with his elbows, his shoulders, and his forearms, and how we keep building and are consistently seeing block over block PRs on his lifts, focusing specifically on his bench. So like I mentioned a moment ago, so JR's main problem he was having with his lifting was that he was able to basically train in a way that would drive progress, but when it came to actually realizing that progress and hitting that next set of PRs, he'd either blow himself up and be out of commission for a while or have to pull back to where he wouldn't be able to actually hit the PRs. And especially on weeks where he had overtime at work, it just really wasn't on the table to be able to progress. And what we'd found is there was a couple small mobility limitations, but I wouldn't say there was anything tremendous that was going on where, he couldn't rotate his arm past here. We were seeing, 10, 15 degree limitations in range of motion. So I'm not going to go through in depth today exactly the drills that we went through for everything, but I'll outline and link in the description down below a series that outlines the strategies we use to actually build up his overall mobility and tendon health with his elbows and his shoulders. It follows a lot of the Postural Restoration Institute principles for restoring that overall shoulder internal and external rotation, internal and external, as well as frankly just addressing the ribs and the upper back. So if you're somebody with stiff shoulders, definitely something to check out. And from there, that basically unlocked the ability to get in and around that like 225, 235 zone on his bench. So purely just by giving him a little bit more mobility, gave us a little bit more leeway to train his bench productively where we had a little more buffer. And that got us to that next set of PRs, but I wouldn't say it was completely comprehensive by any means. In fact, there was definitely still some things to continue to build on. And for me as a coach, one of the big red flags for me when people haven't had a ton of success with other training models, particularly around that recovery, whether it's more on the nervous system side of things, like we've talked about with Taylor and working 70-hour weeks, or somebody like JR, where his workload varies. Some weeks it's 40, some weeks it's 50, 60, 70. but it's very physical and recovery is very demanding, where he's doing a lot of repetitive movements in his day-to-day, is something like a conjugate model can be a really beneficial one. Now, I realize I'm making 2 videos in a row here talking about a conjugate style of training, and it's not the only way I train people, but those lifters who have really high workloads and demands outside of the gym tend to benefit, in my experience, from that style of training, where you basically pick a couple of builder lifts that aren't gonna have maybe quite as much weight as you would normally use on your primary lifts. And then you work on getting really strong with those. And as long as there's a correlation between you improving with those lifts and your primary lift going up, so your competition bench in this case, you're in business. And so this brings us basically to the second phase of training that we're in, where we're finding, hey, we're pretty good, but we're noticing that your strength is not always as predictable as we'd like. And there's some stuff that we can't change, like what your work schedule does, but we can absolutely change the training program to see if we can find some more reliable ways to get your strength timed on a certain week. And so we started experimenting a little deeper with this conjugate style model and noticed a couple of things. We'd started out with a really broad range of lifts. We said, let's train a bunch of different ranges of motion, a bunch of different specialty bars, variants on the lifts, different rep ranges, and let's see, how often do we need to deload? Where is your strength most predictable? Like, at what point in the phase are you your strongest? And what we noticed is that pretty routinely week 3 was about where JR was at his strongest. And there was a couple recurring themes that we noticed. One is we would do an overloading movement in the middle of the block, but with a shorter range of motion, which can be a little bit more forgiving on the pecs and on the shoulders and on the elbows if you're somebody who is sensitive to that kind of thing. That shorter range of motion, the dead stop, all that can be a useful tool in driving a little bit more variation and not just beating exactly the same movement and going competition bench every week. And so we had decided to shorten up his wave into something a little bit different, where we said, hey, let's give you a focus point for the block and say whatever aspect of the lift that we're trying to focus on, let's make that week 3. So we can push the hardest on your 3rd week of your wave. And for JR, that was really just strength out of the bottom, especially with a lot of the pec and shoulder issues he'd had. He wasn't really able to train his pecs super productively. So we said, hey, let's focus on the bottom, especially in competition. Sometimes you get long pause commands, all of this kind of stuff. Or long pauses with a slow press command. And so we said, let's just focus on that. Let's make your chest our focus point with your bench training cycle. And frankly, if you don't know where your weak point is, building your chest up is almost never gonna be a bad choice with your bench. And from there, we worked backward. We said, we know that full range of motion benching for several weeks in a row typically doesn't work well for you. So let's rewind and say, okay, well, the week before your heavy bench, we're gonna give you some sort of a partial range of motion movement. Floor press. Board press is also an option, but for him, floor press was really quite beneficial, so we just stuck with it. And then we trained a movement that, frankly, is just a variation on the bench that's not as stressful on where his problem areas were. So close grip bench for him didn't really bother his pecs quite as much, but it stressed the triceps a little bit more. So we did a little bit more close grip in the first week. And so the idea is we're training something that's going to be similar in load on week 1 to where he would be in week 3 in terms of his potential for strength. And then we're going to train something partial range of motion week 2. And then we're going to train our priority lift on week 3. And this is basically our first wave out of a 2-wave program that we started running. We said, this is great. So that solved problem 1 of being able to give ourselves some stackable wins where month over month, we could basically hit a PR on his 3-count bench. Now from there, the next step we had to figure out was, okay, well, how do we actually time this out for competition when he's aiming for a peak? And we knew that he was always good for 2 weeks in a row of the same lift. Like, that very seldom presented a problem. And as long as we had some kind of fluctuation in load where he wasn't benching heavy with the same lift twice in a row, then we were generally okay. But we couldn't stack that 2 blocks over with a competition style bench, because that's when we'd start to notice, hey, at the end of this 2nd month, we start to run into issues again. And so the next evolution here was basically getting him into a little bit of a shorter bench wave where we started predictably finding, hey, we can get you to this sort of next level on your bench with a short 3-week wave where we do a 3 count. So the same lift as your priority lift where you take like a tough but non-PR set as your week 1, similar to how you'd approach your close grip on your building wave. And then we would take his week 2 and we'd make it somewhere in the realm of about 85 to 90% of what we wanted to hit for a PR on his week 3. This is in a powerlifting context. We basically took his openers on week 2. And then on week 3, we'd actually go for our PR attempt and ranging anywhere between 1 and 3 reps. Now, there was a couple other big differences that we had in the actual program that might not be as evident when we're just looking at like top end focuses. And so the first is that when we had those phases with a little bit less specificity and we're really going more on a conjugate style where we had a close grip, a floor press, a 3-count pause as his primary lifts, we still train bench twice a week. Now, a lot of lifters are proponents of like, well, if you're getting really beat up from training, you should just have smaller training doses and spread them out more evenly. But if you have a really physical job, higher frequency is not going to be the ticket. And so what we did instead is we said, let's program more movements in to take a more bodybuilding approach on your secondary day, because twice a week benching also doesn't really work great for you. And let's focus on building up those weak points that we noticed are present, like your shoulders, your back, your triceps are not super strong and they don't tolerate a lot of load. So we're going to use this more bodybuilding day where we do it first in the week as both sort of a recovery bench day as well as a way to build up all the weak points at a muscle and tendon level. And so basically we ended up with a couple things as mainstays. So we ended up with machine chest press pretty well on all of our blocks because we found that the machines, for whatever reason, didn't beat up his shoulders. He could train his pecs crazy hard. And we basically had not a lot of drawbacks with a lot of positives. From there, we alternated blocks on the secondary day with an overhead press or similar, where we're really focusing on just building the shoulders and shoulder girdle, and taking a more volume-based approach with this, where we're trying to build the total amount of reps week over week here, especially by this 3rd week, and then taking more or less a deload on week 4, so a lighter week of training, if you will. But focusing on just building how many total reps he can do based on his overhead press max. Then we went and did some accessories and some rows. You'll notice as a whole, this day is a little bit lower volume than his primary bench day. And so really leaning into the idea of active recovery and putting something in the ballpark of about 1/3 of his weekly volume on that one day, where the remainder, the majority of his bench volume would actually end up on his secondary day, where we would have his primary lift of the week that we would train, focusing on taking a small PR over the previous time he had done that in that rep range and variant. Sometimes we do it back down, sometimes we just simply build up to a top set, depended a little bit on the week. And then from there, we would get into some additional tricep work. So JM presses are another one like the machine chest press where you found, hey, the shorter range of motion doesn't really beat you up as much. It's specific enough to the bench where we're seeing your bench go up whenever your JM press gets stronger. And you're able to train it heavy enough where it actually has a really good training effect too. And so those are typically auto-regulated for him. Some weeks he's feeling a little more banged up with work, no problem. Other weeks he's feeling fresher and he pushes a little bit more. The fluctuations in volume across the board here are generally enough for him to recover and progress month over month with this movement. And from there, some additional shoulder work just to really add things in. I like to go with the dumbbells for him because as a movement, they're a little bit lighter. They're going to typically demand a little more shoulder stability and are going to be a little more forgiving on the elbows than a straight bar overhead press where you have to torque the elbow. And then from there, we would get into the second block, which is his bench testing block. And so this is where we would say, hey, we're going to aim to have basically your meet. If you're competing or if you're prepping for a meet, we're going to have your powerlifting meet on week 3. So this would be like a weekday bench day, and this would be your weekend bench day here. And then from there, we're just going to work backwards and say, hey, we're taking something in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of what you want to hit for your PR set in the same rep range on week 2. And then we're going to take whatever your primary lift, like your week 3 lift from the previous block, and we're going to do some ascending sets with a little bit of extra volume. So the idea is the volume starts to taper off as we go through that whole block, where he tapers for almost 2 full weeks for his bench, which might seem really long for somebody who's benching under 400 pounds or who weighs under 300 pounds. But for him, this is what worked. We've tried shorter tapers, we've tried pivots instead of deloads, and neither of those really work. He needs just the longer time span in order to flush out that fatigue. And you'll notice as a whole, there's more blank spots as this block goes along because we're just starting to pull exercises out and remove how much total work he's doing over the course of that training block. Aiming to hit a little PR on week 3, and then we take a full deload. This is all super easy stuff on week 4. Rinse, repeat, either take another week off if you need it, or you restart the block from week 1. And that's about it. From there, we would take a look at if we were gonna modify any of his movements, maybe changing his lat pull for a chin up or something along those lines. But having a pretty broad array of exercises we're working with and having that hybrid focus between like a conjugate style for building strength in the first half and then building more of a skill acquisition and transferring that strength he's built in the conjugate style phase into his specific competition phase in block 2, as well as just varying the accessories where he doesn't really do the same accessory twice within the same week. And his average frequency over the course of 2 months is less than 1 week on any given exercise that he's pushing hard on, at least. So you'll notice with block 1, we have overall just more slots, right? So you can see 1, 2, 3 slots, 1, 2, 3 slots. There's really like 6 slots that we're working on developing outside of the primary lift. Whereas on block 2, there's 5 slots, but in reality, it's actually only 4 slots that we're working on developing, and only 3 of those slots are actually pressing movements in the first place. So taking that slot type approach can be a really simple way to say you do more exercises when you're working on generally developing, and you do less exercises when you're trying to get into a competition phase. So hopefully this has been useful for you in understanding a little bit of a different approach. Again, you can access this free file through my links down in the video description below, and there will be timestamps for everything as well if you want to skip to different chapters and see different aspects of what we had gone after. If you've got any questions about the approach, or if you just found this simply useful, I'd love to talk about it in the comments, hear any big takeaways you had, or if you've got a way that you're looking to apply this sort of method to your own training, let's absolutely chat about it in the comments, or we can go more in depth in that powerlifting community that I mentioned, Starting Powerlifting. Again, you can access all the links down below, and if you're not already, make sure to subscribe. We'll see you on the next one. I've got a resource coming out very soon about the top 3 best and worst things you can do at a powerlifting meet. So if you're thinking about competing or you have a meet coming up in the next couple months, definitely something you're gonna wanna check out. So again, make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.